Before we delve into the shadows of the old boarding house, a place where secrets fester behind peeling wallpaper and every creak of the floorboards tells a story, I want to invite you to become part of our community of mystery lovers. The tale you are about to hear is one of darkness, suspense, and a truth so horrifying it will linger with you long after the final word. If you thrive on stories that chill you to the bone and keep you guessing until the very end, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss what's coming. Now, turn down the lights, get comfortable, and let's open the doors to the Crestwood boarding house, where a discovery in the attic is about to unleash a nightmare. The first thing Clara noticed about the water at Crestwood boarding house was its taste. It was faint at first, a subtle metallic tang that clung to the back of her throat, easily dismissed as a quirk of old pipes in an even older building. She had only been a resident for 2 weeks, a new face in a gallery of long-term tenants who moved through the dimly lit hallways like ghosts tethered to a place they could neither love nor leave. Crestwood was a relic, a 4-story Victorian monolith wedged between 2 gleaming, modern apartment complexes, its dark brick facade and grimy, leaded glass windows a stubborn defiance against the relentless march of time. For Clara, it was a sanctuary of anonymity, a place to disappear while she pieced her life back together after it had been shattered into a million unrecognizable fragments. Her room was on the 3rd floor, small and sparsely furnished, with a single window that overlooked a narrow, perpetually damp alley. It was just enough. The other tenants were a collection of solitary souls. On her floor, there was Mr. Alistair Finch, a retired bookbinder in his late 70s who shuffled to the shared bathroom in the pre-dawn hours, his hacking cough a macabre daily alarm clock. Across the hall lived Maya, a young, perpetually exhausted nursing student who communicated mostly through weary smiles and apologetic shrugs when her alarm went off at 4:30 a.m. The 2nd floor housed the more enigmatic residents. There was Julian, the artist, a man in his 30s who was rarely seen but often heard, the faint, melancholic strains of a cello drifting from under his door at all hours. And then there was Beatrice, a stern, middle-aged woman who worked from home as a freelance accountant and seemed to have appointed herself the unofficial enforcer of the house rules, leaving passive-aggressive notes on the communal refrigerator about expired milk and unwashed dishes. The ground floor was the domain of Mrs. Gable, the landlady, a woman whose age was impossible to guess, with a cloud of white hair pinned in a tight bun and eyes that saw everything from behind a pair of thick, cat-eye glasses. She was a fixture, as much a part of the house as its creaking foundations and the scent of dust and decay that clung to the velvet curtains in the foyer. The house had a rhythm, a predictable cadence of comings and goings, of doors clicking shut and footsteps echoing on the worn wooden stairs. It was a rhythm Clara was just beginning to learn. But the water was a discordant note in the familiar symphony. By the 3rd week, the metallic tang had grown stronger, accompanied by a faint, brownish hue that was impossible to ignore. She started buying bottled water for drinking, but the discolored liquid still ran from the showerhead, leaving her feeling less clean than when she'd stepped in. One Tuesday morning, as she was brushing her teeth, she spat into the sink and saw the distinct rusty tint. Wrinkling her nose, she decided she had to say something. It wasn't just an inconvenience anymore. It was a health concern. She found Mrs. Gable in the kitchen, meticulously polishing a set of silver spoons that looked as though they hadn't been used in a century. "Mrs. Gable?" Clara began tentatively. The old woman looked up, her eyes magnified by her glasses. "Clara, dear, is everything all right?" "It's the water," Clara said, holding up her plastic water bottle as evidence of her avoidance. "It's been tasting strange, and now it's discolored. I was wondering if you could call a plumber to check the pipes." Mrs. Gable's hands stilled. For a fleeting moment, an expression Clara couldn't decipher flickered across her face. It wasn't quite fear, not quite annoyance, but something else, something guarded. Then it was gone, replaced by a placid smile. "Old pipes, my dear. They have their moods. It happens from time to time, especially after a heavy rain. The sediment gets stirred up. It will clear on its own." "It's been getting worse, though," Clara pressed gently. "And the pressure on the 3rd floor is almost non-existent." I'll have my handyman, George, take a look when he's next in town, Mrs. Gable said dismissively, her attention returning to the spoons. He's very good. Don't you worry your pretty little head about it. Clara left the kitchen feeling unsatisfied. The landlady's explanation felt too easy, too rehearsed. In the hallway, she ran into Beatrice, who was on her way out, dressed in a severe navy blue pantsuit. Beatrice's lips were pursed in their usual state of disapproval. Did you mention the water? Beatrice asked, her voice sharp and direct. Clara was taken aback. Yes, I did. You've noticed it too. Noticed it? Beatrice scoffed. It's vile. I've been complaining to Eleanor for a week. She gives the same excuse every time. Old pipes, old house. The truth is she's too cheap to pay for a proper plumber. She leaned in conspiratorially, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. She'd rather let us all get sick than part with a single penny. That afternoon, the problem escalated. Maya, the nursing student, knocked on Clara's door, her face pale and etched with worry. The water in my shower just came out black, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Like ink. And the smell. Oh God, the smell. A cold knot of dread formed in Clara's stomach. This was more than just sediment. Together, they went to find Mrs. Gable, but her apartment was dark and there was no answer to their knocks. They decided to talk to the other tenants. Mr. Finch claimed he hadn't noticed anything, but his roomy eyes suggested he wasn't paying much attention to his surroundings anymore. Julian, the artist, didn't answer his door, though they could hear the mournful sound of his cello from within. The smell Maya had mentioned began to permeate the third-floor hallway. It was a sickly sweet, cloying odor that caught in the back of the throat. It was the smell of rot, of something organic breaking down in the most unpleasant way imaginable. By evening, it was unavoidable. Residents were emerging from their rooms, their faces a mixture of disgust and alarm. What is that god-awful stench? Beatrice demanded, marching up the stairs from the second floor, a silk scarf pressed against her nose. Mr. Finch had finally been roused from his apathy. It's coming from the pipes? He rasped, pointing a shaky finger towards the ceiling. It's strongest in the bathroom. It was then that Mark, a charismatic and perpetually cheerful salesman who lived on the second floor and had been oddly absent for most of the day, appeared at the top of the stairs. He was the one who said the words that would change everything. The main water tank is in the attic right above this floor, he said, his usual easygoing smile completely gone, replaced by a grim line. If the problem is with the source, that's where we need to look. There was a collective moment of hesitation. The attic was Mrs. Gable's territory, a place forbidden to tenants, filled with decades of accumulated junk and, according to house lore, the ghosts of residents past. But the smell was becoming unbearable, and the thought of what they were bathing in, what was flowing from their taps, was far more terrifying than a grumpy landlady or a few harmless spirits. Mark was a man of action. He strode down the hall to the small, unassuming door at the end that led to the attic stairs. It was locked. Of course it is, Beatrice muttered. Stand back, Mark said, and with a surprising show of force, he rammed his shoulder against the door. The old wood groaned in protest, but the lock held. He tried again, grunting with effort. On the third try, there was a loud crack, and the door swung inward, revealing a steep, narrow staircase shrouded in darkness and thick cobwebs. The smell that billowed down was overwhelming, a concentrated wave of putrescence that made Clara gag and cover her mouth with her hand. Maya retched into a handkerchief. Good Lord, Mr. Finch whispered, his face ashen. Mark, his jaw set, pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight. I'm going up, he announced. Someone should probably call the police. No one moved. They were all frozen, suspended between the desire to know and the terror of what they might find. Julian's cello had fallen silent. The only sound was the strained breathing of the small group huddled in the hallway. I'll come with you, Clara heard herself say, the words tumbling out before she could second-guess them. She didn't know why. Maybe it was a reporter's instinct from her old life, a compulsion to run towards the story, not away from it. Maybe she just didn't want Mark to go alone. He gave her a grateful nod, and the two of them started up the rickety stairs, the beams of their phone flashlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. The attic was vast and low-ceilinged, a chaotic landscape of dust-covered furniture, stacked boxes, and forgotten treasures. The air was thick and heavy, making it difficult to breathe. The source of the smell was immediately obvious. It was coming from the far corner, where a massive cylindrical metal water tank stood on a raised wooden platform. It was at least 8 feet tall and 4 feet in diameter, an ancient, riveted behemoth that supplied water to the entire house. A dark, viscous liquid was seeping from the main hatch on the side of the tank, dripping slowly onto the floorboards below, creating a dark, spreading stain. As they got closer, the stench became a physical presence, a foul entity that seemed to claw at their throats. "Something's wrong with the lid," Mark said, his voice strained. He pointed his light upwards. The main access hatch on the top of the tank was slightly ajar. "That shouldn't be open." He found a rickety wooden ladder leaning against a nearby wall and propped it against the side of the tank. "Stay there," he told Clara, but she was already right behind him, her own light fixed on the top of the tank. She felt a primal, gut-wrenching dread, a certainty that her life was about to be irrevocably cleaved into a before and an after. Mark climbed the ladder slowly, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. He reached the top, hesitated for a second, and then peered over the edge into the tank. He was silent for a long moment. Too long. "Mark!" Clara called out, her voice a small, trembling thing in the vast darkness. "What is it? What do you see?" He didn't answer. He just leaned back, his body rigid, one hand flying up to cover his mouth. A strangled sound escaped his lips, a guttural cry of pure, unadulterated horror. He scrambled back down the ladder so quickly he nearly fell, his face a mask of shock and disbelief, his skin a sickly, pale green. "Mark, what is it?" Clara cried, grabbing his arm. He couldn't speak. He just pointed a shaking finger back towards the tank, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it seemed to have stolen his voice. Taking a deep breath, steeling herself for the unknown, Clara climbed the ladder. The metal rungs were cold and greasy beneath her hands. The smell was overpowering at this height, a concentrated miasma of death. She reached the top, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She held her phone over the opening and shone the light inside. The water was low, barely a few feet deep, and it was dark and murky, thick with a blackish sludge. But it wasn't the sludge that made her scream. It was what was floating in it. Submerged in the grotesque soup was a human body. It was bloated and discolored, the skin a nightmarish patchwork of gray and purple. The face was turned away, but she could see long, dark hair fanned out in the putrid water like a grotesque halo. The body was in a fetal position, as if trying to shrink away from its own horrific end. And tied to its ankle, weighing it down, was a rusty old toolbox that Clara recognized. She had seen George, Mrs. Gable's handyman, carrying it just last week. Clara's scream was a raw, primal sound that ripped through the silence of the attic, echoing down the stairs to the horrified tenants waiting below. She stumbled back, losing her footing on the ladder, and tumbled the last few feet to the floor, landing in a heap beside Mark. But she didn't feel the pain. All she could see was the image burned onto the back of her eyelids. The body in the water. The water they had been drinking. The water they had been bathing in. The sirens began to wail in the distance, a sound that in any other circumstance would have been alarming, but now felt like a lifeline, a promise that this waking nightmare was about to be acknowledged by the outside world. Downstairs, Beatrice was shouting, her voice shrill with panic. Mr. Finch was weeping softly. The sound of Julian's cello started up again, but this time it wasn't melancholic. It was a frantic, discordant shriek of strings, as if the instrument itself was screaming along with them. Clara lay on the dusty attic floor, shaking uncontrollably, the foul taste of the water still clinging to her tongue. It was a taste she knew she would never forget. It was the taste of decay. It was the taste of death. And as the flashing blue and red lights painted fleeting, monstrous shadows across the attic's grimy window, a terrifying thought began to take root in her mind. This was no random accident. In a house of secrets, a body in the water tank wasn't just a tragedy. It was a message. And as she looked at Mark's terrified face, she realized with chilling certainty that the true horror wasn't floating in the tank above them. It was standing in the hallways below, hidden behind the closed doors of Crestwood boarding house, waiting. The nightmare had just begun. The arrival of the police shattered the insular, time-warped world of Crestwood boarding house. The building, usually a tomb of quietude, was suddenly flooded with harsh light and loud voices. Uniformed officers and grim-faced detectives moved through the hallways with a purposeful energy that felt alien and intrusive. The tenants were herded into the small, stuffy communal lounge on the ground floor, a room filled with mismatched, threadbare furniture and the lingering scent of Mrs. Gable's lavender air freshener, which now did little to mask the stench of death that still hung in the air. Clara sat on a lumpy sofa, a coarse police-issue blanket draped over her shoulders, though it did nothing to stop the tremors that racked her body. The image of the body in the tank was a relentless, looping horror film in her mind. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the pale, submerged limbs, the cloud of dark hair. She could still taste the water, a phantom foulness that made her stomach churn. The lead detective was a man named Miles Corrigan. He was in his late 40s, with a weary, lived-in face and eyes that seemed to have seen every variation of human cruelty. He didn't radiate intimidation. Instead, he had a calm, methodical presence that was somehow more unnerving. He addressed the assembled tenants, his voice a low, steady rumble that commanded attention. "My name is Detective Corrigan," he began, his gaze sweeping over each of them, lingering for a fraction of a second too long on every face. "As you know, a body has been discovered on the premises. At this stage, we are treating this as a suspicious death. We will need to speak with each and every one of you. No one is to leave the building until we have a preliminary statement. We need to know who the deceased is and what they were doing in that water tank." A forensics team was already working in the attic. The process of removing the body was a slow, grim affair, the sounds of their movements echoing from above. The victim was eventually identified from a water-damaged wallet found in a pocket. His name was Daniel Miller. The name meant nothing to Clara. She scanned the faces of the other tenants, searching for a flicker of recognition, but was met with a collection of blank, stone-like expressions. No one admitted to knowing him. Mrs. Gable was the first to be interviewed. She was taken into her private apartment, and the door was closed. She was in there for over an hour. When she emerged, her face was pale and drawn, her usual stern composure replaced by a fragile vulnerability. The protective shell had been cracked. One by one, the other tenants were called in for their interviews, which were conducted in the dining room. Beatrice went in with an air of indignant authority, as if this whole affair was a personal inconvenience arranged specifically to disrupt her schedule. She emerged 45 minutes later, her lips pressed into a thin, white line, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Mark, the salesman, seemed to have regained some of his composure. His interview was brief and to the point. He recounted their discovery in the attic with a clear, steady voice, but Clara, watching him, noticed the slight tremor in his hands as he clasped them in his lap. Mr. Finch was almost incoherent, his age and the shock of the event rendering him confused and tearful. Maya, the nursing student, was quiet and clinical, answering the detective's questions with the detached precision of someone trained to deal with trauma, though her pallor betrayed her inner turmoil. Julian, the reclusive artist, had to be coaxed from his room. When he finally appeared, he was a startling sight. Tall and gaunt, with a wild mane of dark hair and deeply sunken eyes. He looked like a romantic poet from another century who had somehow stumbled into a modern-day crime scene. He clutched a worn, leather-bound sketchbook to his chest like a shield. His interview was the longest of all. Finally, it was Clara's turn. She sat across from Detective Corrigan at the large mahogany dining table. Another detective, A younger woman named Officer Reyes sat beside him, taking notes. "Miss Evans," Corrigan began, his voice gentle. "I know this has been a traumatic experience. Just tell me, in your own words, what happened." Clara recounted everything, from the first strange taste of the water to the moment she had shown her light into the tank. She described Mrs. Gable's dismissiveness, Beatrice's complaints, the growing stench, and Mark's decision to break down the attic door. Corrigan listened patiently, his eyes never leaving her face. "You said you'd only been living here a few weeks?" he asked. 3 weeks yesterday," Clara confirmed. "And in that time, did you notice anything unusual? Any arguments? Any strangers coming or going?" Clara thought back. The house was always quiet, the tenants keeping to themselves. "No, not really. It's a very solitary place. Everyone has their own routine. We barely interact." "What about the deceased Daniel Miller? Have you ever seen him before? Take a look at this." He slid a photograph across the table. It was a driver's license photo. The man was in his late 30s, with thinning brown hair, a weak chin, and an expression that was both resentful and nervous. Clara stared at the face. It was completely unfamiliar. "No, I've never seen him in my life." Corrigan leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "That's what everyone says. Mrs. Gable swears he's never been a tenant. No one recognizes him. Yet he ended up in a locked attic in a sealed water tank in a boarding house full of people. Somebody is lying, Miss Evans." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The idea that one of the people she shared a roof with was a liar, and possibly a killer, sent a fresh wave of ice through Clara's veins. Over the next few days, Crestwood boarding house transformed from a quiet refuge into a prison of paranoia. The police presence lessened, but the atmosphere grew thicker, choked with suspicion. The water was shut off, and the tenants had to use bottled water for everything, a constant, grim reminder of what had happened. They were all still persons of interest, forbidden from leaving the city. The preliminary coroner's report revealed that Daniel Miller had not drowned. He had been killed by a single, powerful blow to the back of the head before being placed in the tank. The time of death was estimated to be about 10 days prior, which coincided perfectly with when Clara had first noticed the strange taste in the water. The murder weapon was missing. Clara found it impossible to stay in her room. The silence of the house felt menacing now. Every creak of the floorboards, every door that closed down the hall, sent a jolt of anxiety through her. She began to observe the other tenants more closely, her old journalistic instincts kicking in. They were no longer just her neighbors. They were suspects. Beatrice became even more reclusive, scurrying from her room to the shared kitchen and back, her face a perpetual mask of fury. She had loud, angry phone conversations in her room, her voice sharp and clipped, though Clara could never make out the words. Once, Clara saw her in the hallway, scrubbing furiously at a small, dark stain on the runner carpet outside her door, her movements frantic and obsessive. When Beatrice noticed Clara watching, she shot her a look of pure venom and slammed her door shut. Mark's easygoing charm had curdled into a nervous energy. He paced the hallways, talking on his phone in hushed, urgent tones. He claimed to be talking to his sales manager, explaining the situation, but he seemed agitated, constantly looking over his shoulder. Clara noticed that he had a series of long, deep scratches on his left forearm, which he tried to keep hidden under his shirt sleeves. When she'd asked him about them, he'd laughed it off, saying he'd had a run-in with a thorny bush while jogging, but his eyes didn't meet hers. The most profound change was in Julian. The cello music that used to drift from his room ceased entirely. The silence from his apartment was more disturbing than the melancholic music had ever been. Clara grew worried. One afternoon, driven by a mixture of concern and suspicion, she knocked on his door. There was no answer. She knocked again, louder this time. "Julian? Are you okay in there?" After a long pause, the door opened a crack. Julian peered out, his eyes wide and fearful in his pale face. "What do you want?" he whispered. I just wanted to see if you were all right." "We haven't heard from you." He seemed to consider her for a moment, his gaze intense. Then he opened the door wider. "Come in," he said, his voice barely audible. His apartment was a chaotic explosion of art. Canvases were stacked against every wall, some finished, some terrifyingly incomplete. The room was dominated by a single, massive painting on an easel, covered by a white sheet. The air smelled of turpentine and oil paint. He gestured for her to sit on a paint-spattered stool. "The police think one of us did it," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. "They asked me about my past. They know I was in a psychiatric hospital a few years ago." Clara didn't know what to say. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I see the way you watch everyone," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "You're looking for the truth. But you should be careful what you look for in this house." He gestured vaguely at the walls around them. "Every brick is saturated with secrets." He walked over to the large, covered painting. "I paint what I feel, the emotions in this house. For the past year, I've been painting him." "Painting who?" Clara asked, her heart beginning to pound. With a swift movement, Julian pulled the sheet off the easel. Clara gasped. The painting was a portrait, but it was fractured and nightmarish, rendered in angry slashes of dark, violent colors. It was a face contorted in fear and rage. But beneath the expressionistic chaos, the features were unmistakable. It was the man from the driver's license photo. It was Daniel Miller. "You knew him?" Clara breathed, rising from the stool. "I didn't know his name," Julian said, his voice trembling. "But I knew his face. He used to come here late at night. He would always go to Mrs. Gable's apartment. They would argue." Her voice, I've never heard her sound like that. It was filled with hatred. The revelation sent a shockwave through Clara. Mrs. Gable, the frail, elderly landlady, had lied. She knew the victim. This changed everything. That evening, armed with this new information, Clara felt a surge of reckless determination. She had to find out what Mrs. Gable was hiding. Waiting until she saw the landlady leave to put out the recycling bins, Clara slipped down to the ground floor. The door to Mrs. Gable's apartment was locked, but Clara had noticed that the lock was an old, simple one. Her own door used a similar key. With trembling hands, she took her key from her pocket and slid it into the lock. It met resistance, but with a jiggle, she heard a faint click. The door swung open. She slipped inside, her heart hammering. The apartment was immaculately clean, a museum of a lifelong past, filled with doilies, porcelain figurines, and sepia-toned photographs. It smelled of potpourri and old paper. Clara didn't know what she was looking for. A letter? A photograph? Anything that would connect the landlady to Daniel Miller. She moved to a small writing desk in the corner. She carefully opened the drawers. The first two were filled with stationery and bills. In the bottom drawer, tucked beneath a stack of old postcards, she found a small, leather-bound ledger. She opened it. The pages were filled with names and dates, written in Mrs. Gable's spidery, elegant script. It was a record of tenants going back decades. But on the last few pages, the entries were different. They weren't tenant records. They were lists of names, and next to each name was a large sum of money and a date. Clara recognized the names. Beatrice, Mark, Mr. Finch, Julian. They were all there. Each of them had been paying Mrs. Gable thousands of dollars, every month, for years. Then she saw the last entry. The name was Daniel Miller, but instead of a payment, next to his name were two words, written in a shaky, frantic hand. He knows. The entry was dated 2 weeks ago. Suddenly, she heard a key in the front door of the apartment. Panic seized her. Mrs. Gable was back. Clara looked around wildly for a place to hide. The only option was a tall wardrobe against the far wall. She scrambled inside, pulling the heavy wooden door shut, leaving only a tiny crack to peer through. She held her breath, praying the old woman wouldn't see that the desk drawer was slightly ajar. Mrs. Gable entered the apartment, but she wasn't alone. Mark, the salesman, followed her in. closing the door quietly behind him. "Did anyone see you, Mrs. Gable asked, her voice no longer the gentle, grandmotherly tone she used with the tenants. It was cold, sharp, and full of authority. "No, we're clear," Mark said. "But we have a problem. That new girl, Clara. She's asking questions. And Julian. He's a time bomb. He saw Daniel that night." Mrs. Gable walked over to the desk and saw the slightly open drawer. She froze. Her head snapped up, her eyes scanning the room, cold and calculating. Clara's blood ran cold. She knew, with a sickening certainty, that Mrs. Gable was looking right at the wardrobe. "We need to accelerate our plans," Mrs. Gable said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper as she took a slow step towards the wardrobe. "The secret is already unraveling. Miller's death was sloppy. It has drawn too much attention. Now we have to deal with the loose ends." She paused, her hand reaching for the wardrobe handle. "Starting with the ones who get too curious." Inside the dark, cramped wardrobe, Clara felt the last of her breath leave her body. The terrifying secret of Crestwood boarding house was not just about a murder. It was something far bigger, a conspiracy that involved nearly everyone. And she had just made herself the next loose end. The click of the wardrobe latch turning was the loudest sound she had ever heard. The click of the latch was followed by an agonizing silence. Clara's world narrowed to the suffocating darkness of the wardrobe, the scent of mothballs and old wool filling her lungs. Her body was rigid, every muscle screaming for her to either fight or flee, but she was trapped. She could hear her own heart, a frantic drumbeat against the stillness. She braced for the door to be flung open, for the cold eyes of Mrs. Gable to meet hers. But instead of the wardrobe door, it was the apartment door that burst open. "Eleanor, there's a problem." It was Beatrice's voice, sharp with panic. She stormed into the room, not even registering Mark's presence. "The detective is back. Corrigan. He's going door to door. He's on the second floor now. He's asking about Miller again, but he's being specific. He's asking if anyone saw him on the night of the 12th. Mrs. Gable, her hand still hovering inches from the wardrobe handle, slowly turned to face Beatrice. The predatory focus on the wardrobe was broken, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "Calm yourself, Beatrice. Panicking will solve nothing." "Don't tell me to be calm." Beatrice shot back, her voice a harsh whisper. "This is falling apart. We should have gone to the police when he first showed up. We should have paid him what he wanted. And what would have happened then?" Mark interjected, his voice low and tense. "He would have bled us dry and then exposed us anyway. He was a cornered rat, and cornered rats get vicious. This was the only way. This way involved a body in our water supply and the police treating us like criminals," Beatrice hissed. From her hiding place, Clara tried to process the frantic, whispered exchange. "He first showed up, paid him what he wanted. Daniel Miller hadn't been a stranger. He had come here with a purpose. He was blackmailing them. All of them." The ledger in the desk drawer suddenly made a horrifying kind of sense. The payments weren't rent. They were hush money. "Enough," Mrs. Gable commanded, her voice cutting through the rising tension. The frail old woman was gone, replaced by a figure of formidable, chilling authority. "What's done is done. We stick to the story. None of us knew him. He was a stranger, a burglar perhaps, who fell into the tank by accident. Mark, you go upstairs. Intercept the detective. Stall him. Beatrice, go back to your room. Act normal. I will be up in a moment." Her orders were given with such finality that neither Mark nor Beatrice dared to argue. They scurried out of the apartment like chastened children. The moment the door clicked shut, Mrs. Gable moved with a speed that belied her age. She went to the desk, slammed the ledger shut, and shoved it back into the drawer. Then, she walked to the fireplace, prized a loose brick from the hearth, and pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in an oily rag. She unwrapped it. It was a hammer, a ball-peen hammer with a dark, crusty stain on its head. The murder weapon. Clara felt a wave of nausea. This woman, this seemingly harmless grandmother, was a cold-blooded killer. Mrs. Gable re-wrapped the hammer and placed it back in its hiding spot just as a sharp knock sounded at her apartment door. "Mrs. Gable? Detective Corrigan. I need to have another word with you." Mrs. Gable's entire demeanor shifted in an instant. The hard, calculating woman vanished. When she opened the door, she was once again the frail, slightly confused landlady. "Oh, detective. Come in, come in. Has there been a development?" Clara remained frozen in the wardrobe, a captive audience to the surreal performance. Corrigan entered the room, his eyes doing a slow, methodical sweep. Clara prayed he wouldn't notice the faint scent of her perfume or the subtle disturbance of the dust on the floor near the wardrobe. "We've been canvassing the neighborhood," Corrigan said, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. A convenience store owner a few blocks away recognized Daniel Miller's photo. Said he came in almost every week for the past year. Always paid with a crisp $100 bill. Said Miller mentioned he was visiting his aunt who lived in an old boarding house nearby. Corrigan paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Funny thing, you told me you'd never seen him before in your life. But Daniel Miller was your nephew. Wasn't he, Eleanor?" The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Gable's facade didn't crumble. It evaporated. Her back straightened, and a look of pure, unadulterated loathing hardened her features. "He was my sister's boy, a worthless leech, just like his mother." "So you lied to us?" Corrigan stated flatly. "I did what was necessary to protect my tenants," she retorted, her voice like ice. "To protect this house." "Protect them from what? From your nephew, who you murdered and dumped in a water tank." Corrigan's voice was dangerously quiet. Mrs. Gable laughed, a dry, rasping sound devoid of any humor. "You still don't get it, do you, detective? You think this is about me. It was never just about me." She gestured towards the ceiling. "This house, Crestwood, is not just a boarding house. It's a sanctuary. Every tenant who lives here was chosen. Each one of them came here broken, fleeing from a past they couldn't escape." She began to pace the room, her movements animated, her eyes gleaming with a fervent light. "Mr. Finch, the gentle bookbinder? 30 years ago, he was a driver in a hit-and-run that killed a child. He was never caught, but the guilt consumed him. Beatrice, the meticulous accountant? She embezzled her last company into bankruptcy, destroying the lives of hundreds of employees. She got away with it, but she lives in constant fear of discovery. Mark, the charming salesman, is a pathological gambler who owes a very dangerous amount of money to some very dangerous people. He's hiding here. And Julian, my poor, tormented artist. He was committed by his family after a psychotic break. A break in which he almost killed his own father. He's terrified of being sent back." Clara's mind reeled. The secrets of the tenants were far darker than she could have imagined. They weren't just a random collection of lonely souls. They were fugitives from their own lives. "I gave them a place to hide," Mrs. Gable continued, her voice rising with passion. "A place to be anonymous, to live out their days in peace. All I asked for in return was their loyalty, and their money, a small price to pay for salvation. Wouldn't you agree?" "And what about you, Eleanor?" Corrigan asked. "What's your secret?" Mrs. Gable stopped pacing and smiled, a chilling, joyless expression. "My secret is the foundation of this house. Years ago, my husband was a very wealthy and very cruel man. He died in a fire that I set. I inherited his fortune and used it to buy this house to create this covenant. And your nephew found out," Corrigan finished for her. "He learned about your past, about the arrangement you have with your tenants, and he decided he wanted a piece of the action. He blackmailed all of you." "He was greedy," Mrs. Gable spat. "He threatened to expose us all, to bring everything crashing down. My tenants are my family. They are my life's work. I would not let that little parasite destroy it." "So you killed him," Corrigan said. "On the night of the 12th, he came here to collect his payment. You argued, and you hit him with that hammer you keep in the fireplace. It was a brilliant, chilling guess. Mrs. Gable's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. I did what I had to do. And then you needed help? Corrigan pressed on. Miller was a big man. Too big for you to haul up to the attic on your own. Who helped you? Eleanor? Was it Mark? He seems strong enough. It doesn't matter, she said, her voice regaining its composure. You have no proof. Don't I? Corrigan took a step closer. We found fibers on Miller's clothes. Wool fibers that match that old coat you always wear. And we're about to get a warrant to search this entire apartment. We will find the murder weapon, Eleanor. It's over. For a moment, Mrs. Gable seemed to deflate. The years suddenly caught up with her, and she looked like a frail, tired old woman. But then, a sly, cunning look entered her eyes. It's not over, Detective, she said softly. You see, you're right. I didn't act alone. We acted together. Suddenly, the apartment door swung open again. Mark and Beatrice stood in the doorway, and behind them, holding a tire iron, was Mr. Finch. His gentle, roomy eyes were now hard and determined. From the hallway, the discordant, frantic sound of a cello began to play. Julian's battle cry. The Covenant of Crestwood is a simple one, Detective, Mrs. Gable said, her voice filled with a chilling sense of triumph. We protect this house. We protect each other. At any cost. Corrigan slowly reached for his holster, but Mark was faster. He lunged forward, tackling the detective to the ground. Beatrice slammed the door shut and locked it. Mr. Finch advanced into the room, the tire iron held high. In that moment, Clara knew she was no longer just a witness. She was a liability. They would never let her or the detective leave this apartment alive. Her survival instinct finally overwhelmed her paralysis. As Mark and Corrigan wrestled on the floor, she burst out of the wardrobe, screaming. The sudden appearance of another person threw the room into chaos. Mrs. Gable stared, her mouth agape in genuine shock. For a split second, everyone was frozen. Clara didn't hesitate. She grabbed a heavy porcelain lamp from a side table and swung it with all her might at Beatrice, who was closest to the door. The lamp shattered against Beatrice's head, and she crumpled to the floor. Clara fumbled with the lock, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Mr. Finch started towards her, raising the tire iron. You shouldn't have come here, child, he rasped. Get down, Corrigan yelled. He had managed to get his arm free and had drawn his weapon. He fired a single shot not at Mr. Finch but at the ceiling. The deafening blast and the shower of plaster was enough to make the old man flinch and stumble backward. It gave Clara the time she needed. She wrenched the door open and scrambled out into the hallway, screaming, "Police! Help! Call the police!" at the top of her lungs. The sound of the gunshot had alerted the uniformed officers who had been waiting outside. They swarmed the building, their own weapons drawn. The standoff in Mrs. Gable's apartment was over in seconds. Clara stood in the hallway, trembling and gasping for air, as her fellow tenants were led out in handcuffs. Mark, his face bruised and furious. Beatrice, dazed and bleeding from her head. Mr. Finch, looking frail and lost without the tire iron in his hand. And finally, Mrs. Gable. She walked with a strange, regal dignity, her head held high. As they led her past Clara,